confession to make. I don't love horror films. There are a few I've seen and enjoyed, but on the whole, they aren't my first choice when it comes to movie watching. But with Halloween approaching, it got me thinking more about horror movies, and as I delved into it, I discovered that the genre doesn't get a lot of love from the critics either. And in the 94-year history of the Academy Awards, only 18 horror films have won an Oscar, and only a handful of those have been for the more prestigious categories. So it got me thinking, why does a film genre with such a large and passionate fan base receive so little praise from the critics? Join me in today's video as I discover which horror films have received the most critical acclaim and others that perhaps deserve more recognition. Who knows, I may even find myself appreciating the genre more. Before I continue, if you are new here, this is Cinema Retrospective, where I take a look back at the best and worst of film history and answer some of those questions that I've been thinking about for years. And hey, they may even be questions that you've had too. So welcome back to my channel, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Horror films have been around for decades. In fact, we've been watching scary scenes unfold on screen for over a century, so it's clear that millions of people enjoy that heart-pounding, nail-biting, stomach-churning kind of fear that goes along with the genre. Studies have actually been done into the psychology of horror fans, and it's been discovered that it can actually be a mood booster. According to a study completed by Aarhus University in Denmark, the adrenaline rush that comes from watching a horror film leaves the viewer with an elevated mood. And the upside is that it's an adrenaline rush that can be done in a safe environment, because although our body reacts to the sight of a knife-wielding maniac as if they were really chasing us, our logical brain tells us it's not real. For other horror fans, watching a scary movie allows them to experiment with how their body reacts to fear, but with something fictional. This experimentation may have paid off during the recent pandemic. The study showed that horror fans were more psychologically resilient. The study's research scientist Matthias Klassen said playing with fear helps us learn what our body does under pressure and how to make it through in one piece, whether the stakes are fairly high or fairly low. So is it just that film critics and award judges aren't adrenaline junkies? Or is there more to it? Well, it's hard to say with film critics because they are as diverse as any audience, but when it comes to the awards shows, there is a history of genre bias, with voters giving preferences to dramas and historical narratives. This is for a few reasons, but basically there is a stigma around horror films. Despite the critical and commercial success of some horror movies, there is still a perception that the genre is primarily about shock and gore, rather than artistic merit. This stigma can affect how horror films are received during award season. The genre also tends to receive nominations for the more technical categories like Best Makeup and Hairstyling, Best Visual Effects, or Best Sound Editing, rather than the more prestigious categories like Best Picture or Best Director. All this being said, there are some horror films throughout history that have broken the mould, and in recent years there appears to be more and more films that are transcending the genre, leaving audiences and critics alike with an appreciation for horror. To date, the Oscars have had over 550 film nominations for Best Picture, and yet only 6 of those have been for a horror film. And of those 6, only 1 has successfully walked away with the win. The film was Silence of the Lambs. Silence of the Lambs is perhaps the most successful horror film when it comes to critical acclaim, but even it doesn't sit purely in the horror genre. Its praise was often centered around its psychological thriller aspects. Nonetheless, it did seem to change the game for filmmakers. As pointed out in an article by Kath Clark for The Guardian, before Lambs, films portraying psychopathic killers tended to be cheap and nasty. Until Lecter came along, pairing fine wines with human body parts, serial killers had mostly been a gaggle of claw-handed bogeymen with melty faces and rubber masks. By contrast, Lecter was highly intelligent, with impeccable manners. A lot of the praise from critics went to Anthony Hopkins for his portrayal of Hannibal Lecter. Roger Ebert stated that his performance is likely to be referred to for many years when horror movies are discussed. The character is listed at number 1 on the AFI's list of villains, and Hopkins won the Best Actor Oscar for his restrained and measured performance as Hannibal Lecter. Also praised for her performance as Clarice was Jodie Foster, but the film was a risk for the actress, with several other big-name stars turning down the role due to the subject matter. Foster, however, was keen to play a woman who saves other women, after she'd spent her previous films playing the role of a victim. The risk paid off for Foster, who also took home the Oscar for Best Actress. Jodie Foster was not the first or the last to be awarded the Best Actress Oscar for a horror film. Kathy Bates was given the honour of being the first for her portrayal as an obsessive nurse in the 1990 film Misery. Then in 2010, Natalie Portman received the award for her role in Black Swan, which wasn't necessarily marketed as a horror film, but many certainly deem it to be one. Now, if Silence of the Lambs was the most successful horror film when it comes to critical acclaim, The Exorcist would have to be the most commercially successful. It also changed the game for filmmakers because studios began to see how profitable a horror film could be, and therefore began putting more money into these type of films. The Exorcist made history when it was the first horror film to be nominated for the Best Picture Academy Award. It didn't take home the win, but it did earn a total of 10 nominations, taking out 2 in the categories of Best Sound and Best Adapted Screenplay. More recently, some horror films have been given the praise and recognition they deserve. Most notably would be Jordan Peele's directorial debut in Get Out. The film has a 98% score on Rotten Tomatoes, and critics have collectively praised its ability to mix social commentary with spine-tingling fear. Peele himself even began to refer to it as a social thriller. Reviewer Scott Mendelsohn wrote for Forbes magazine that it mines discomforting tension from everyday racial inequities and microaggressions. The film was also recognised by the Academy with the award for Best Original Screenplay, which was significant because it made Jordan Peele the first African American to win the award. It was also recognised with nominations for Best Actor, Best Director and Best Picture. It appears that the voters of the Academy Awards were quite split in their opinions of this film, with younger voters giving their votes to the movie, while older voters believed it was not a typical Oscar film. Despite this, it was still an incredible feat for Get Out to receive so many nominations. Unfortunately, Peele's second offering for horror fans did not receive the same attention, despite being equally well crafted. Us was not the only horror film to miss out on much-deserved praise, and when I began to delve deeper into horror films that didn't receive awards or critical acclaim, I was quite shocked by some of the films that were listed. Back in 1960, Alfred Hitchcock gave the world Psycho, one of Hollywood's most recognisable films and known now as the first slasher horror film. Although some of the special effects have since dated, at the time it was incredibly scary and shocking to audiences. Today it is considered by many to be among the greatest films, but it certainly didn't receive a positive response from reviewers at the time. Some labelled it a blot on an otherwise honourable career, while some critics found the violence to be disturbing and questioned its place in mainstream cinema. It again missed out on the recognition it deserved when it didn't win any of the Academy Awards it was nominated for. History has since told a different story, with Hitchcock's masterpiece being praised in the decades that followed. It has left such a legacy on movie making that it is often referenced in other films and by other filmmakers. Even some of the original critics admitted that they may have gotten that one wrong. Another iconic film, The Shining in 1980, deviated from the typical conventions of a horror film, leaving critics quite unsure what to make of it. Like many of the great classics, it received mixed reviews and performed only moderately well at the box office. Not only did it not win any awards, it was also not nominated for many. And it did have some strong competition that year. Stanley Kubrick was surely deserving of the Best Director award for this shot alone. But sadly, his work was less conventional and therefore harder for award voters to embrace. Now, this next one might still get a mixed response, perhaps because it's been parodied so many times, but you have to admit that The Sixth Sense had to have one of the biggest twist endings of all time, and Haley Joel Osment gave an outstanding performance for someone of his age. This one is a little different to the others mentioned on this list in that it did actually receive an overwhelmingly positive response from the critics. However, that didn't seem to translate when it came to the awards season, as it managed to receive many nominations without taking home any of the wins. More recently, fans of the horror genre were disappointed at the lack of recognition for the film Hereditary. While many critics praised its thought-provoking themes, eerie atmosphere and strong performances, with lead actress Toni Collette in particular earning rave reviews, others found it too disturbing and confusing. The general consensus is that it was a critical success, but seemed to fall short with mainstream moviegoers, and it was ultimately missing from the list of nominees in the award seasons that followed its release. So, after delving into the world of horror films and trying to understand their appeal, I think it's pretty clear that there is a bias against the genre when it comes to awards voters, and it certainly seems that a film with the horror label is automatically viewed as being cheap and generic. But at the end of the day, each to their own, I guess. Some film critics seem to appreciate the art of the thrillers, while others turn up their noses. Filmmaking is an art, and all art is subjective, so opinions will inevitably be divided. Maybe just more so for this genre than for others. But what do you think? Are you a horror movie fan, or have I maybe even changed your mind with this video? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, I love discussing these themes with my viewers, even if our opinions differ. While you're there, I'd love for you to subscribe to Cinema Retrospective for more film history, and if you've learnt something new from this video, then I'd love for you to hit that like button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.